The Aeleri were not a warrior species. That was the first thing every traveler learned about them, usually within the first hour of arriving in their territory. Their ships carried no visible weapons. Their stations had open observation decks instead of defense turrets. Even their communication signals were unusual. Long, layered harmonics that drifted across open frequencies like music instead of coded bursts of encrypted data. Other species sometimes paused their transmissions just to listen. The Aeleri were small by galactic standards, barely taller than a human child, with slender limbs and feather-like filaments that shimmered softly along their arms and shoulders. Their eyes were large and bright, reflecting starlight in a way that made them appear perpetually curious, as if every moment of existence was a question worth exploring. And in many ways, that was exactly how they lived. Where most civilizations measured progress in territory or military strength, the Aeleri measured it in knowledge. Their worlds were covered not with fortresses or factories, but with observatories, libraries, and quiet cities built around gardens that stretched for kilometers beneath transparent domes. They believed the galaxy was something to understand, not something to conquer. For nearly 3,000 years, the Aeleri had been members of the Stellar Accord, the great interstellar alliance that governed most known space. In all that time, their voting record had become something of a legend among diplomats. They had never once voted in favor of military intervention. Not once. When conflicts arose between member civilizations, and they often did, the Aeleri delegation always argued for mediation, negotiation, or time. Time for anger to cool. Time for leaders to reconsider decisions made in moments of fear or pride. To many species, this seemed naive. But to others, it was quietly admirable. Aeleri ships were a common sight across the trade routes of the inner systems. Their vessels carried researchers, teachers, artists, and archivists who traveled between civilizations exchanging knowledge. Entire universities had formed partnerships with Aeleri academies, and countless young scholars from dozens of species had studied in their orbiting research habitats. Those habitats were famous throughout the Accord. Imagine vast rings of glass and silver drifting slowly through space, their interiors filled with forests, lakes, and open courtyards where students from 100 worlds debated philosophy beneath alien constellations. That was the Aeleri idea of power. Not domination. Understanding. One of their most famous projects was the Lumine Archive, an immense structure orbiting the pale blue star of Cerati. It was not a fortress or a shipyard, but something far more ambitious. It was a library. Over the course of 2 centuries, the Aeleri had gathered records from thousands of civilizations, languages, histories, cultural works, scientific discoveries, and preserved them within the archive's endless data vaults. To the Aeleri, every species that rose among the stars was a story worth remembering. And forgetting those stories, they believed, was the closest thing the galaxy had to true tragedy. Visitors who walked through the archive often described the same strange feeling. A quiet sense that the building itself was listening. That every corridor, every chamber, every holographic record carried the weight of civilizations that had struggled, grown, and sometimes vanished long before most of the current powers had ever built their first starships. The Aeleri called this idea continuity. The belief that every generation of the galaxy inherited the responsibility of protecting the next. Perhaps that was why their worlds were so peaceful. Crime was rare. Warfare was almost non-existent. Even their planetary defenses, modest shield arrays and a handful of patrol craft, existed mostly to deflect asteroids or intercept the occasional pirate vessel that wandered too close to their borders. The Aeleri simply did not think like conquerors. They thought like caretakers. And because of that, for thousands of years, they had assumed something that many species in the Accord quietly believed as well. That the age of conquest was over. That the great powers of the galaxy had grown beyond the brutal instincts of their earliest histories. That civilization itself had become a kind of protection. For a long time, that belief seemed justified. Until the day the war fleets arrived. The Karvath Dominion did not believe in peace. Not the kind the Aeleri believed in, at least. Where the Aeleri saw the galaxy as a network of shared futures, the Karvath saw it as something far older and simpler, an arena where only the strong deserved to remain. They were a species shaped by a brutal world. Karvath Prime orbited a red giant star whose violent radiation storms frequently scorched its surface. Entire continents had been rendered uninhabitable over the course of their early history. Resources were scarce, climates unstable, and survival often depended on the ability to seize what another city or tribe possessed before they could defend it. The Karvath evolved accordingly. Tall, scaled, and powerfully built, they possessed heavy bone structures and thick armored skin that could withstand environmental extremes most species would find lethal. Their eyes were narrow and cold, adapted to harsh sunlight and the constant vigilance required on a world where weakness was rarely forgiven. Their culture reflected that origin. Strength was admired. Hesitation was not. From the moment a young Karvath could walk, they were taught the central lesson of their civilization: control your environment before it controls you. At first, that philosophy had been applied only to their own world. Cities competed for territory. Governments rose and fell in cycles of conquest and consolidation. Eventually, after centuries of conflict, one faction achieved something none before it had managed: unity. The warlords who founded the Dominion did not end conflict, they simply redirected it outward. When the Karvath launched their first interstellar vessels, they carried with them a belief that had been forged across millennia of struggle. The galaxy was not a community. It was an opportunity. At first, their expansion had gone mostly unnoticed by the greater powers of the Stellar Accord. The frontier regions were vast, and dozens of minor civilizations existed beyond the primary trade routes. Small systems disappeared. Isolated colonies fell silent. Merchant convoys failed to arrive. The explanations were always uncertain. Pirates, accidents, local conflicts. By the time the pattern became clear, the Karvath Dominion already controlled nearly 24 star systems. And unlike many rising powers, the Dominion had no interest in diplomacy. They rarely issued declarations of war. They did not negotiate treaties. Their fleets arrived without warning, struck quickly, and withdrew before any organized response could form. Military analysts eventually identified their preferred targets: small civilizations, peaceful ones, species that had never developed large defensive fleets or hardened planetary shields. The Dominion considered such societies inefficient uses of galactic space. Their logic was simple: if a civilization could not defend its worlds, it did not deserve to keep them. Within the chambers of the Stellar Accord, this philosophy was widely condemned. Official resolutions denounced the Dominion's actions as violations of interstellar law. Trade sanctions were proposed. Investigations were launched. Committees were formed. But the Dominion had studied the Accord carefully. They understood its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. Every decision required consensus. Every response required debate. Every action required time. Time to gather evidence. Time to verify reports. Time to organize joint responses between dozens of member species with different political priorities. The Dominion moved faster than that. By the time an emergency session was called, the conquest was already complete. By the time sanctions were approved, the Dominion had already withdrawn its fleets and fortified the captured systems. And by the time the Accord began discussing military intervention, the political will for such action had usually faded. It had worked that way for decades. System after system. World after world. The Dominion expanded slowly but relentlessly, like a shadow spreading across a star map. And through it all, there was one kind of civilization they had never targeted. Not yet. The peaceful scholars. The quiet caretakers. The species whose ships carried books instead of weapons. To the Karvath Dominion, the Aeliri represented something more than weakness. They represented an idea the Dominion despised: the belief that power could exist without violence. For years, the Dominion had watched them, studied their trade routes, mapped their colonies, measured their defenses, and eventually, as Dominion strategists often did, they reached a conclusion. A species that believed peace would protect them had already lost the war. They just did not know it yet. The attack order was issued 2 weeks later. The first Aeliri colony to fall was Talaris. It was a quiet world orbiting a soft yellow star on the outer edge of Aeliri territory, known more for its research observatories than for any strategic importance. From orbit, the planet looked like a jewel: vast oceans broken by green continents and wide fields of silver-domed cities where scholars and students lived among gardens and open courtyards. Talaris had no military base. It had never needed one. The warning came in the form of a faint distortion on the long-range scanners of the planetary traffic station. At first, the technicians believed it was a sensor malfunction. The readings were strange, too large for a merchant convoy, too organized for random debris, and moving far too fast for any natural phenomenon. Within minutes, the station attempted to identify the approaching formation. What they found made no sense. Hundreds of vessels. Massive ones. Warships. The transmission they sent to the Planetary Council was brief and confused. Unknown fleet entering system. Configuration suggests military formation, requesting clarification from Accord authorities. No clarification came, because the fleet did not slow down. It did not hail the colony. It did not transmit demands. The Dominion ships simply spread out into a massive orbital grid around the planet, their dark hulls blotting out the distant stars. For a moment, the people of Tal Eris believed it must be some kind of mistake. Illyri diplomats attempted to contact the fleet. Scholars gathered in the observatories, studying the strange vessels with curiosity rather than fear. Even the Planetary Council assumed there would be a message, some explanation for such an enormous military presence in peaceful territory. The message arrived 20 seconds later. It was not words. It was light. Brilliant spears of energy fell from orbit, striking the surface with terrifying precision. Entire districts vanished in expanding rings of white fire. Communication towers disintegrated before alarms could finish sounding. The first volley targeted infrastructure, spaceports, power grids, defense satellites that were never designed to withstand real warships. Then the second volley began. Cities burned. The peaceful domes that sheltered gardens and research halls cracked open like fragile glass under the relentless bombardment. Fires spread through residential districts. Emergency vehicles raced through streets filled with smoke and falling debris. Across the planet, millions tried to understand what was happening. The Illyri had never experienced an invasion before. There were no evacuation bunkers, no hardened shelters, no emergency military command centers prepared to coordinate a planetary defense. Only frightened civilians and overwhelmed local authorities struggling to respond to a disaster they had never imagined. Within 12 minutes, the planetary communication grid collapsed. The final message that escaped Tal Eris came from a small orbital weather station drifting beyond the main defense perimeter. Its automated system transmitted a continuous distress signal on every known Accord frequency. A single sentence repeated over and over. Unprovoked attack, civilian world under bombardment, requesting immediate intervention. The signal continued broadcasting for 17 minutes. Then the station vanished from sensors. By the time the Stellar Accord received the transmission, it was already too late. But the Dominion was not finished. Within the next 30 hours, 4 more Illyri worlds were attacked. Each strike followed the same pattern. No warning. No demands. No negotiations. Just overwhelming orbital bombardment delivered with cold, mechanical efficiency. The colony of Saren Vale, home to one of the largest Illyri universities, lost nearly 300 million inhabitants when its orbital habitats were shattered and sent crashing into the atmosphere. The ocean world of Hal Iris burned for 2 days after Dominion ships ignited its floating cities. And in the Serati system, the Lumine Archive, the great library that had preserved the history of thousands of civilizations, was struck by kinetic projectiles powerful enough to fracture its massive orbital ring. Millions of historical records vanished in seconds. Entire cultures erased from memory. Across the galaxy, the broadcasts began spreading. Footage from damaged satellites. Fragments of distress calls. Blurry images of burning cities viewed from orbit. The death toll climbed by the hour. Hundreds of millions. Then billions. And still the Dominion fleets continued their methodical assault. To them, this was not cruelty. It was strategy. The complete destruction of the Illyri infrastructure would ensure the species could never become a threat in the future. When the final bombardment ended, 5 worlds had been reduced to smoking ruins. Over 6 billion Illyri were dead. The survivors scattered across space in refugee convoys, carrying with them fragments of a civilization that had once believed knowledge alone could protect them. And throughout the halls of the Stellar Accord, one terrible question echoed through the emergency channels. How could something like this happen? In a galaxy that believed it had moved beyond war? The emergency session of the Stellar Accord Council began 36 hours after the first attack. By then, the images had already spread across nearly every major communication network in known space. Burning cities, collapsed orbital habitats, endless streams of refugee vessels drifting through the void. For many civilizations of the Accord, the destruction of the Aeleri worlds felt unreal. For thousands of years, the Alliance had maintained the belief that large-scale interstellar war was something that belonged to ancient history. But the evidence floating across the holodisplays in the council chamber was impossible to ignore. 5 worlds destroyed. 6 billion dead. Entire archives of galactic history reduced to drifting fragments of metal and shattered data cores. The chamber itself was enormous, built to house representatives from hundreds of species. Rings of elevated platforms surrounded a central diplomatic floor where speakers addressed the assembly. Holographic projectors hovered in the air above the delegates, displaying live footage from the devastated systems. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the debates began. The representative of the Thalrian Combine was the first to rise. "Before we consider any military response," the tall, pale diplomat said, "we must verify the authenticity of these reports. Several of the transmissions we've received are incomplete or damaged." A wave of quiet disbelief rippled through the chamber. But the Thalrian delegate continued calmly. "It would be irresponsible to initiate interstellar conflict without a full investigation. The Dominion has not yet officially acknowledged responsibility for these attacks." Across the chamber, another delegate stood. "The attackers were identified visually by multiple surviving satellites," she replied sharply. "Their fleet signatures match Dominion vessels exactly." "Sensor data can be falsified," the Thalrian representative responded. A murmur of frustration spread among the gathered diplomats. More voices joined the debate. The Valorian Republic proposed economic sanctions. The Orden League suggested forming a fact-finding committee. Another delegation recommended opening diplomatic channels with the Dominion to determine whether the attacks might have been the result of regional misunderstandings. Meanwhile, the casualty numbers continued to rise as rescue teams uncovered more destroyed cities. Several smaller species demanded immediate military intervention. They argued that if the Dominion could annihilate the peaceful Aeleri without consequences, no minor civilization would ever be safe again. But the larger powers hesitated. The Accord had not fought a full-scale war in nearly 4 centuries. Mobilizing a combined fleet required enormous logistical coordination and unanimous political approval. Some governments feared escalation. Others worried about the economic consequences of conflict. And a few quietly admitted what many were already thinking. The Dominion fleets were powerful. Very powerful. Several intelligence reports suggested that confronting them directly might result in losses far greater than the Accord was prepared to accept. So the debates continued. Hour after hour. Resolution proposals were written, then rewritten. Committees were suggested. Subcommittees were formed. A temporary investigative task force was authorized to gather additional evidence before any further action could be considered. Outside the council chamber, news networks broadcast the proceedings across dozens of star systems. Many viewers watched in disbelief. Refugee ships filled the orbital lanes around nearby worlds, carrying survivors of the destroyed Aeleri colonies. Medical stations struggled to treat the injured. Emergency housing facilities were constructed to accommodate millions of displaced civilians. And while all of this was happening, the council continued to debate procedure. Late in the session, one of the younger delegates stood and addressed the chamber with visible anger. 6 billion civilians have been killed, she said. Their worlds were not military targets. They were libraries, universities, research colonies. If this council cannot respond to something like that, then what exactly is the purpose of the Accord? The chamber fell briefly silent. Then another diplomat spoke calmly from across the room. The purpose of the Accord, he said, is to prevent rash decisions that could lead to wider war. Several delegates nodded in agreement. A vote was called shortly afterward. The result was announced an hour later. The Stellar Accord would not authorize military intervention. Not yet. Instead, a formal diplomatic summit would be organized. Representatives from the Dominion would be invited to explain their actions and negotiate a peaceful resolution to the crisis. The announcement spread quickly across the galaxy. For the survivors of the Aeleri worlds, the decision felt like a second catastrophe. But within the council chamber, most delegates seemed relieved. War had been avoided. At least for now. And throughout the entire debate, one representative had remained completely silent. The human ambassador. He had not spoken once during the 12-hour session. Not when the destruction footage was shown. Not when the death toll was announced. Not when the final vote was taken. He simply sat at his station, watching the proceedings with an expression that none of the other delegates could quite interpret. Calm. Quiet. Waiting. Because while the council believed it had chosen caution, humanity had already reached its own conclusion. Ambassador Daniel Reyes had attended 43 emergency sessions of the Stellar Accord during his 12 years of diplomatic service. He had watched border disputes spiral into shouting matches between rival governments. He had witnessed trade negotiations collapse over tariffs so small they would have seemed absurd to ordinary citizens. He had even sat through a 7-hour argument about asteroid mining rights in a system no one actually lived in. Diplomacy, he had learned, moved slowly. Painfully slowly. That was its nature. The Stellar Accord had been designed to prevent war by making war extremely difficult to start. Every military action required votes, consensus, and endless layers of procedural approval. It was inefficient by design. For centuries, that inefficiency had preserved peace. But sitting in the council chamber now, watching the footage of burning Aeleri cities loop across the hovering holoscreens, Reyes could not escape a quiet, uncomfortable realization. Some systems worked perfectly, right up until the moment they didn't. He leaned back slightly in his seat as another delegate began speaking about the importance of maintaining diplomatic channels with the Dominion. The words blended into the background noise of the chamber. Reyes had already read the intelligence briefings. All of them. While the Council debated procedures, Earth's Strategic Analysis Bureau had been examining every piece of data available from the attacks. Fleet compositions, weapon signatures, tactical formations, communication patterns. The conclusions were clear. The Karvath Dominion had not acted impulsively. The assault on the Aeleri worlds had been carefully planned months in advance. Their fleets had struck 5 separate systems almost simultaneously. Orbital bombardments had targeted infrastructure first, ensuring planetary defenses collapsed before any meaningful evacuation could occur. This wasn't a raid. It was extermination. And the Dominion knew exactly what they were doing. Reyes glanced across the chamber toward the Aeleri delegation platform. Only one representative remained. The others had been killed when the Lumine archive station was destroyed. The surviving delegate, an elderly scholar named Lethari, stood quietly beside the railing of the platform, watching the council with hollow eyes. The faint silver filaments along his arms had lost their usual soft glow. Entire cities of his people had vanished in less than 2 days. And the most powerful alliance in the galaxy was currently debating whether it needed more evidence. Reyes felt a familiar weight settling into his thoughts. Humanity had joined the Stellar Accord only 72 years earlier. Compared to most member civilizations, they were still considered newcomers, an ambitious young species with a reputation for rapid technological development and unusually direct diplomacy. Many older species viewed humans with cautious curiosity. Their history was complicated. Unlike the Aeleri, humanity had not grown up in peace. Their homeworld had experienced thousands of years of warfare before they ever reached the stars. Nations had risen and fallen through conflict. Entire continents had been shaped by the consequences of military decisions. War was not theoretical to them. It was historical memory. Perhaps that was why Earth's representatives often sounded different during council debates. While many diplomats spoke in cautious hypotheticals, humans tended to ask more uncomfortable questions. What happens if negotiation fails? What happens if the aggressor never intended to negotiate in the first place? Reyes checked the small display built into his console. A message from Earth had arrived 20 minutes earlier. It was short. Just 2 sentences. Authorization confirmed. Proceed when ready. He closed the message window and looked back toward the center of the chamber. Another delegate was proposing a 30-day investigation period before the planned diplomatic summit with the Dominion. 30 days. Reyes imagined what the Dominion fleets could accomplish in 30 days. More colonies destroyed. More refugees drifting through space. More civilizations quietly wondering whether the Accord would protect them if their turn came. He stood slowly. At first, only the nearest delegates noticed. The human ambassador had not spoken during the entire emergency session, and his sudden movement drew curious glances across the chamber. The debate gradually quieted. Several representatives turned toward the human platform. Reyes walked calmly to the edge of the speaking floor. For a moment, he simply looked around the enormous council chamber, the gathered diplomats, the floating images of ruined Aeleri worlds, the endless tiers of seats where the galaxy's leaders had been arguing for the past 12 hours. Then he activated the central microphone and spoke for the first time that day. The council chamber slowly fell silent as the human ambassador stepped onto the central speaking platform. Hundreds of delegates watched him, some with curiosity, some with mild irritation at the interruption, others with quiet expectation. Humanity had a reputation within the Accord for speaking plainly when others preferred diplomacy wrapped in softer language. Ambassador Daniel Reyes rested his hands lightly on the railing in front of the microphone. He did not raise his voice. He did not rush. When he spoke, his tone was calm, measured. "Honored delegates," he began, "I have listened carefully to today's discussions." His eyes moved slowly across the chamber. To the proposals for investigations. A pause. To the committees. Another pause. And to the planned diplomatic summit with the Karvath Dominion. A few representatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Reyes continued. Humanity respects the purpose of the Stellar Accord. The framework of cooperation this alliance created has prevented countless conflicts over the centuries. He gestured toward the holographic projections floating above the chamber. The burning cities of Tal Eris flickered silently in the air. But the events of the past 2 days raise a question that cannot be ignored. He looked directly at the central council ring. What is the value of law, if it cannot protect the innocent? No one answered. Across the chamber, several delegates exchanged uneasy glances. Reyes continued speaking, his voice steady. The Aeleri were a peaceful civilization. They possessed no military fleet capable of threatening the Dominion. Their worlds contained universities, archives, and research facilities. Not fortresses. He paused again. 6 billion civilians were killed. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. For a moment, the chamber remained completely silent. Then one of the senior council members leaned forward slightly. "Ambassador Reyes," the delegate said carefully, "the council shares your concern. But decisions of this magnitude require careful deliberation. If we act too quickly—" Reyes gently raised one hand. The delegate stopped speaking. For the first time since he had taken the platform, the human ambassador allowed a small trace of steel to enter his voice. "Humanity understands deliberation," he said. "Our history contains more than enough examples of wars started too quickly." He glanced briefly toward the Aeleri platform where Lethari stood silently watching. "But our history also contains examples of what happens when aggression goes unanswered." A quiet ripple moved through the chamber. Many of the older civilizations had studied humanity's past. They knew the stories. World wars. Planetary conflicts. Entire eras defined by the consequences of delayed action. Reyes activated the display on his console. A small symbol appeared above the speaking platform, the blue and white emblem of the Terran Union. "When humanity joined the Stellar Accord," Reyes said calmly, "we agreed to respect the authority of this council." He let the statement settle. However, he took a breath. Humanity did not agree to ignore genocide. The word spread through the chamber like a shockwave. Several delegates leaned forward. Others whispered urgently to their aides. Reyes looked around the council one final time. Then he delivered the sentence that would later be repeated across half the galaxy. Slowly, clearly, without raising his voice. "Humanity will not be attending the summit." The chamber froze. For a moment, the words seemed not to register. Then confusion erupted. Delegates began speaking at once. "What summit? What does that mean?" "Ambassador Reyes, the diplomatic summit is the Council's official response." Reyes calmly deactivated the microphone. But before leaving the platform, he added one final sentence. Quiet. Simple. Unmistakable. Instead, he said, we will be attending the battlefield. The council chamber erupted. Voices overlapped in a chaotic wave of protest, confusion, and alarm as the meaning of the human ambassador's words settled into the minds of the assembled delegates. Military action. Unilateral military action. A step like that had not been taken by any Accord member in nearly 400 years. Several representatives stood immediately. Ambassador Reyes, this is unacceptable. You cannot take military action without council authorization. Humanity is bound by the Accord Charter. Reyes waited calmly until the noise began to fade. Then he reactivated the microphone. I am aware of the Charter, he said. And I assure you, humanity intends to follow it. That answer only deepened the confusion. One of the senior Valorian diplomats leaned forward sharply. The Charter explicitly prohibits independent military campaigns between member species, she said. If the Terran Union launches an attack on the Dominion, you will be violating the very treaty that allowed your civilization to join this alliance. Reyes nodded once. You are correct, he replied. If this were a war between two governments. The chamber quieted again. Slowly, the human ambassador activated another projection above the speaking platform. A series of images appeared in the air. The ruins of Tal Eris. The shattered orbit of Seren Vale. The burning oceans of Haliris. Each image lingered for several seconds before the next replaced it. These were not military targets, Reyes said quietly. These were civilian worlds. Another image appeared. The broken ring of the Lumine Archive, drifting through space in thousands of glowing fragments. Entire cultural records were erased in seconds, he continued. Histories that belonged not only to the Aeliri, but to dozens of other civilizations whose knowledge had been preserved within that archive. The delegates watched in silence. Many of them had contributed materials to the archive over the years. Now those records were gone. Reyes folded his hands behind his back. For centuries, he said, the Stellar Accord has operated on the assumption that all member governments recognize certain basic limits. He began pacing slowly along the edge of the platform. Limits on warfare. Limits on targeting civilians. Limits on the destruction of cultural heritage. He stopped walking and faced the chamber. These limits exist for a reason. They allow conflict to occur without destroying the very foundations of civilization. A few diplomats nodded. These were principles most species had accepted long ago. Reyes continued. But what happens when a government deliberately ignores those limits? No one answered. What happens when a regime chooses extermination over conquest? Another long pause. The human ambassador looked across the chamber one last time before speaking again. His voice was still calm, still controlled. But there was no mistaking the weight behind his words. Human history contains many tragedies, he said. Wars that spiraled out of control. Governments that committed atrocities against their own people and others. He paused briefly. We learned something from those mistakes. A new symbol appeared above the speaking platform. It was not the emblem of the Terran Union. It was a document, a legal declaration, one that had been quietly transmitted to every government in the Accord only minutes earlier. Reyes gestured toward it. This is the Terran doctrine of civilized conduct. Several translators across the chamber began whispering rapidly as they processed the unfamiliar text. The core statement appeared in bold characters. Reyes read it aloud. Slowly, clearly. Any government that commits deliberate, large-scale extermination of civilian populations forfeits its recognition as a lawful authority within the community of civilizations. The chamber went completely silent. Reyes continued. Such regimes will no longer be treated as sovereign states. They will not be negotiated with. They will not be invited to diplomatic summits. They will not be granted the protections normally afforded to recognized governments. He paused, and then finished the declaration. Instead, they will be treated as criminal organizations responsible for crimes against civilization itself. The implications spread across the chamber like a shockwave. This wasn't a declaration of war. It was something else entirely. One of the older council members finally spoke. "You are redefining the rules of interstellar conflict," the delegate said carefully. Reyes nodded. "No," he replied. "We are enforcing the rules that already exist." He gestured again toward the floating images of destroyed Aeleri worlds. "If the law cannot protect the innocent." He paused. "Then it becomes the responsibility of those who can." Another quiet ripple moved through the chamber. Several delegates were no longer arguing. They were listening. Because for the first time since the attacks began, someone was proposing a response that did not involve waiting. Reyes deactivated the projection and returned to the microphone. "The Terran Union will not declare war on the Karvath Dominion," he said. Another murmur passed through the chamber. Instead, he finished calmly. "We will conduct a law enforcement operation." Then he stepped away from the platform and left the council chamber. Behind him, the delegates of the Stellar Accord stared at the fading projection of the Terran doctrine and began to understand that humanity had just changed the rules of the galaxy. 3 hours after Ambassador Reyes left the council chamber, the first Terran fleets began to move. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic broadcast across the galaxy. Humanity did not issue threats, ultimatums, or declarations of vengeance. They simply acted. Deep within the Sol system, far from the crowded orbital cities and trade routes of Earth, the silent shipyards of Luna Command activated their long-dormant mobilization protocols. Massive docking clamps released vessels that had spent years drifting quietly in standby orbit. At first glance, the ships did not appear especially intimidating. Terran warships lacked the extravagant armor plating or oversized weapon arrays that many alien militaries favored. Their hulls were smooth and dark, built with an efficiency that suggested practicality rather than intimidation. But military analysts who had studied them knew better. Human ships were designed for one purpose: ending fights quickly. Across several hidden fleet anchorages, hundreds of vessels began aligning into tight formation patterns. Navigation beacons flickered on one by one as command networks synchronized. Carrier groups, strike fleets, long-range interdiction wings. Each formation moved with calm precision, like pieces of a puzzle sliding into place. Within 30 minutes, the first fleets entered jump space. Their destination was not announced. But it did not take long for the galaxy to guess. The news reached the Karvath Dominion 4 hours later. Deep within the heavily fortified command world of Dravakar, Dominion strategists gathered inside a massive war chamber lined with holographic star maps. Admiral Karvath, commander of the 3rd Expansion Fleet, studied the incoming intelligence reports with mild curiosity. "Terran vessels are mobilizing?" he asked. "Yes, Admiral," replied one of the analysts. "Multiple fleet signatures detected leaving Sol system. Course trajectories indicate outer transit lanes." Karvath leaned back slightly. "Estimated fleet size?" "Approximately 300 combat vessels." A few officers exchanged amused glances. 300 ships. The Dominion had deployed more than twice that number during the Aeleri campaign alone. Karvath dismissed the concern with a casual wave of his clawed hand. "Let them move," he said. "The Terrans are young. They are reacting emotionally." The Dominion officers understood that kind of reaction very well. Many civilizations made the same mistake when confronted with overwhelming destruction. They rushed into battle seeking revenge. And they died. Still, Karvath ordered a standard precaution. Inform the border fleets to increase patrols along the outer territories. If the Terrans approach Dominion space, they will be intercepted. "Yes, Admiral." The officer paused before adding, "There is one unusual detail in the intelligence reports." Karvath raised one eyebrow ridge. "Explain." "The Terran fleets are not broadcasting any diplomatic traffic." That was odd. Most species sent communications before initiating military action, demands, threats, or declarations meant to intimidate their opponent or justify their response to the wider galaxy. "Are they transmitting encrypted signals?" Karvath asked. "No, Admiral." The analyst hesitated. "They are not transmitting anything." Silence filled the war chamber. Carveth leaned forward slightly. Nothing. Nothing. No threats. No negotiation attempts. No diplomatic channels. The Terran fleets were simply moving through space in complete radio silence. For the first time, the Dominion admiral felt a faint flicker of curiosity. That is unusual. But he was not worried. Not yet. The Dominion had fought dozens of campaigns against species that underestimated its strength. Their fleets were faster, larger, and more experienced than anything the Terrans could realistically deploy. Even if the humans attacked directly, the Dominion would crush them. It would be a harsh lesson, but a necessary one. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the Stellar Accord was watching the situation unfold with growing unease. Emergency communications flooded the council chamber. Terran fleets have entered the Helion corridor. Additional formations detected leaving Sol system. Estimated fleet mobilization continues to rise. Several diplomats attempted to contact the Terran government. Most received the same automated reply. Terran Union strategic operations are currently underway. Diplomatic inquiries will be addressed after mission completion. That response did not calm anyone. Observers began tracking the Terran fleets using long-range sensors positioned along the outer trade routes. At first, their movements seemed strangely indirect. Rather than heading directly for the Dominion capital systems, the fleets appeared to be spreading outward, dividing into smaller formations as they moved deeper into contested territory. Military analysts began mapping the trajectories. The pattern slowly emerged. And when it did, several experts felt a sudden chill. The Terrans were not heading toward a single target. They were heading toward all of them. Every major Dominion naval base. Every shipyard. Every strategic logistics hub that supported the Dominion's expansion fleets. The humans weren't planning a single battle. They were preparing something far more dangerous. A coordinated dismantling of the Dominion's entire military infrastructure. When this realization finally reached Admiral Carveth, the amusement vanished from his expression. He stared at the updated star map for a long time. "Signal all fleets," he said quietly. "Yes, Admiral." Carveth's voice hardened. "Prepare for combat." Across Dominion space, alarms began echoing through dozens of military installations. But even as their fleets rushed to defensive positions, the Terran armadas continued advancing. Silent, disciplined, and unstoppable. Because humanity had not come to threaten the Dominion. They had come to remove it. The first Dominion naval base to fall was Outpost K-17. It was not a famous installation. In fact, most of the galaxy had never heard of it. The base orbited a dim orange star near the outer frontier of Dominion territory, serving primarily as a logistics hub where expansion fleets resupplied before launching campaigns deeper into unclaimed space. From a strategic perspective, it was routine. From humanity's perspective, it was step one. The Terran strike group arrived without warning. Long-range Dominion sensors detected the fleet only 30 seconds before it emerged from jump space. Emergency alarms echoed through the station corridors as the automated defense grid attempted to identify the incoming vessels. 27 Terran warships. They appeared in perfect formation, sliding out of jump space like dark silhouettes against the distant stars. Dominion Command immediately opened a communication channel. "This is Dominion Military Installation K-17, the station commander transmitted. "You have entered restricted territory. Identify yourselves and state your purpose." There was no reply. The Terran ships continued forward. The station commander frowned. "Repeat. Unknown fleet, you are approaching a military facility of the Carveth Dominion. Alter course immediately or defensive measures will be taken." Still nothing. The silence was unsettling. Most civilizations announced their presence in battle. Threats, declarations, warnings meant to establish dominance before the fighting began. But the Terran fleet said nothing. They simply continued moving. The station's defense cannons powered up. Targeting computers locked onto the approaching vessels. "Final warning," the commander transmitted. "Withdraw immediately." The Terran fleet reached optimal firing distance. And then the battle ended. From the Dominion perspective, it happened almost too quickly to comprehend. Several of the Terran ships launched small, almost invisible objects that streaked across space at incredible speed. They were not missiles in the traditional sense. Their engines burned briefly before shutting down completely, leaving them drifting silently toward their targets. Dominion sensors struggled to track them. Then they arrived. The first kinetic strike impacted the station's main power relay with devastating precision. The second tore through the central communication tower. A third obliterated the docking ring where supply vessels were currently refueling. Within 12 seconds, Outpost K-17 lost power. Without shields, its defensive cannons went offline. The Terran fleet fired exactly once more. A cluster of directed energy beams sliced through the station's primary reactor housing. The massive structure split open like fragile metal. Then it exploded. The entire engagement lasted 43 seconds. The Terran ships did not remain to celebrate their victory. They simply adjusted course and jumped to their next target. Across Dominion territory, the same pattern began repeating. Naval Base Tarkesh Prime lost its shipyard before its defense fleet could even launch. The massive manufacturing platforms orbiting Gorath Station were destroyed by precision strikes that left the nearby civilian settlements completely untouched. Dominion carrier groups rushing to intercept Terran fleets found themselves ambushed by coordinated attack formations that seemed to anticipate their every move. The Terrans did not fight like other species. They fought like engineers dismantling a machine. Every strike targeted something specific. Command centers, shipyards, fuel depots, fleet coordination hubs. The essential components that allowed the Dominion military to function as a unified force. Civilian infrastructure was ignored. Entire Dominion cities watched Terran fleets pass overhead without firing a single shot. At first, many Dominion commanders assumed this was a mistake. Surely the Terrans would escalate eventually. Surely they would attack population centers the way the Dominion had done during the Aeleri campaign. But the pattern never changed. Humanity was not interested in destruction. They were interested in removal. One by one, the Dominion's military capabilities vanished. Shipyards exploded. Defense platforms collapsed. Entire fleets were trapped without supply lines or command coordination. Within 72 hours, the Dominion had lost nearly half of its operational fleet capacity. Admiral Carveth watched the disaster unfold from the command center on Dravakar. The star map in front of him was changing faster than his officers could update it. Red markers, Dominion installations, were disappearing across the entire frontier. "This is impossible," one strategist whispered. Carveth said nothing. He had finally understood the Terran strategy. They were not fighting a war. They were executing a systematic dismantling operation. The Dominion had spent decades building a vast military machine capable of conquering weaker civilizations. Humanity had identified every vital component of that machine, and was removing them one by one. No dramatic battles. No reckless charges. Just cold, calculated efficiency. Another officer approached the command platform. "Admiral, new report from the northern sector." Carveth looked up slowly. "Yes. The Terran fleet has reached Fortress Draction." For the first time, Carveth felt genuine concern. Fortress Draction was the Dominion's most heavily defended installation outside their capital system. Hundreds of warships protected it. Massive planetary shield arrays surrounded it. If the Terrans intended to destroy it, they would face the full strength of the Dominion Navy. Carveth watched the incoming sensor data carefully. The Terran fleet emerged from jump space. 60 ships. They did not charge. They did not engage the defending fleet. Instead, they launched something unexpected. Thousands of small drone craft spread outward like a metallic storm. Dominion targeting systems attempted to track them. But the drones moved too quickly. Within minutes, they had reached the shield generators surrounding the fortress. Then they began cutting. Not blasting. Not exploding. Cutting. Precision beams carved through the shield emitters with surgical accuracy. One by one, the massive defense systems went dark. The fortress shields collapsed. The Terran fleet fired exactly 3 volleys. The central command core of Fortress Draction disintegrated. And just like every other engagement, the Terrans left. Carveth stared at the updated star map. For the first time since the Dominion had begun its expansion centuries earlier, their military power was shrinking faster than they could replace it. Humanity was not destroying the Dominion civilization. They were doing something far worse. They were stripping away its ability to dominate others. Across the galaxy, observers began realizing the same thing. This was not revenge. This was enforcement. And by the time the Terran fleets finished their campaign, the Dominion would no longer be capable of conquering anyone ever again. The Terran fleets stopped their advance on the 7th day. Not because they had been forced to. Not because the Dominion had mounted an effective defense. But because their mission was complete. Across Dominion territory, the once powerful military infrastructure that had fueled decades of conquest now existed only as scattered debris fields drifting silently through space. Shipyards were gone. Fleet coordination centers were gone. Supply depots, command stations, forward operating bases, gone. Entire sectors of Dominion space that had once housed thousands of warships were now eerily quiet. The surviving Dominion vessels remained in orbit around their home systems, unable to coordinate large-scale operations without the network that had previously connected their military forces. Humanity had not destroyed the Dominion civilization. They had simply removed its weapons. For the first time in centuries, the Karvath Dominion could no longer project power beyond its own borders. And just as quietly as they had arrived, the Terran fleets began withdrawing. No victory broadcasts echoed across the galaxy. No triumphant declarations were made. The ships simply turned toward home. Within 2 days, the last Terran fleet exited Dominion space. The war, if it could even be called a war, was over. The emergency session of the Stellar Accord resumed shortly afterward. This time, the chamber was far more crowded. Delegations from dozens of additional civilizations had arrived to witness the aftermath of the most dramatic military campaign in modern galactic history. The numbers were still being compiled. Over the course of 1 week, humanity had neutralized 42 Dominion naval bases, 19 shipyards, 31 fleet coordination hubs. Hundreds of warship civilian casualties reported during the campaign. 0. The difference between the Dominion's attack on the Aeleri and humanity's response was impossible to ignore. The chamber lights dimmed slightly as the Terran ambassador returned to the speaking platform. Daniel Reyes looked exactly the same as he had during the previous session. Composed. But the atmosphere around him had changed. No one interrupted when he activated the microphone. "Honored delegates," he began quietly, "the Terran Union has concluded its operation." A large projection appeared above the chamber, displaying the updated map of Dominion territory. The once dense network of military installations had almost completely vanished. "The Karvath Dominion remains a functioning civilization," Reyes continued. "Their population centers are intact. Their infrastructure remains operational. Their citizens are safe." He paused. "But their military expansion capability has been permanently dismantled." Several diplomats shifted uneasily. This outcome had not been voted on. It had not been approved. Humanity had simply done it. Reyes continued calmly. "The Terran doctrine of civilized conduct remains in effect." He gestured toward the floating document introduced during the previous session. "The purpose of this doctrine is not conquest. It is deterrence." He allowed the word to settle. Civilizations that follow the basic laws of interstellar conduct will never see a Terran fleet in their skies. But governments that choose extermination, he paused, will no longer be protected by diplomatic procedure. Silence filled the chamber, because everyone present understood what he was really saying. The rules of the galaxy had changed. For centuries, the Stellar Accord had relied on slow diplomacy to maintain peace. Now there was something else. A final consequence. One of the senior delegates finally spoke. "Ambassador Reyes," she said carefully, "are you suggesting that humanity intends to act as enforcement for the entire galaxy?" Reyes considered the question for a moment. Then he shook his head slightly. "No." A quiet murmur passed through the chamber. "We are suggesting something simpler." He looked across the vast council hall one last time. Civilization only survives when its laws mean something. The projection above the chamber shifted. The image of the destroyed Aeleri worlds appeared once more, followed by a second image. Terran fleets leaving Dominion space. Reyes delivered his final statement. Slowly, clearly, so every civilization in the chamber would remember it. Humanity does not seek war. But when the laws of civilization are broken, he paused. We make sure they are enforced. In the years that followed, something strange happened across the galaxy. Aggressive expansion campaigns began to decline. Several warlike governments suddenly adopted far more cautious foreign policies. Military analysts quietly added a new variable to their strategic calculations. Not just enemy fleets, but Terran response time. Because the lesson of the Dominion campaign had spread everywhere. Humanity did not threaten. Humanity did not negotiate with exterminators. Humanity simply arrived. And when they left, the war was already over.